when I'm trying to get someone to stop using alcohol or heroin to kind of resolve the inner debate or ambiguity in the client.
It's an addiction I understand since I had it myself in my 20s. I struggled with an opiate addiction for years.
It seems like we've all accepted the idea that we can't just be, and we've always got to do or consume something, or else we're not. Welcome to How to Be an Adult, a podcast created by the practitioners at the Morpheus Clinic for Hypnosis in Toronto, Canada. This is a show for people just like you who've inadvertently become adults and don't know what to do about it. I'm Luke Chow, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Marc Lewis, author of best-selling books like The Biology of Desire. He's formerly a professor at the University of Toronto. He's a cognitive scientist and a neuroscientist and a psychotherapist in private practice. He's the author of close to 100 articles about developmental psychology and especially to the public, the field of addiction. More specifically, he advocates against the medical model of addiction that I think we can agree disempowers the people it's supposed to help. So, Marc, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Luke.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Let's begin with this. Would you like you or me to try to summarize your views on addiction in a couple of sentences?
So generally what I have been writing about and arguing for years now, almost 10 years, is the idea that rather than think of addiction as a disease, a brain disease, a pathology per se, think of it as a psychological habit, a cognitive habit, a very strongly emotional habit, a habit which is motivated by intense emotions and therefore becomes deeply ingrained, deeply entrenched, and partly for that reason is extremely hard to break, even though you certainly understand at some level that it's not doing you any good and in fact might be making your life into a horrible mess, might become extremely boring and destructive in various ways. And trying to understand what's the value of substance use or other kinds of addictive practices that make it hard to give up, not only because it's a habit, but also because it's doing something for you, something that you're not able to do as well or as reliably in the rest of your life. So really looking at it from the point of view of the science, the psychology, but also from the person's point of view, the person who is using substances and having a hard time stopping.
Well, all of us who have even a light addiction to our phones or to social media, let alone something like alcohol or cigarettes or gambling, your explanation of addiction seems just simply intuitive. It matches so many people's actual lived experience of what it's like to find it impossible to put down your phone or to tell yourself erroneously that you need a drink just because you're going through a breakup when actually what you need is something like love instead. How did it end up being that the predominant model of addiction is a disease model, which is so counterintuitive, not just to me as a hypnotherapist or to you as a psychotherapist and a scientist, but to, I think, even members of the public whose experiences of addiction are not one where they become some kind of fiend that's controlled by some kind of demon?
I would hope not, yes.
No.
There was a time in the 1930s, 40s, 50s when that was in fact the kind of public vision, the optics, the idea that addiction is like a fiend. And it was represented by, pictures of people doing horrible back things or seeing their shadows in the background where they're playing with needles and so forth. And often in those days, black people who had, for whom institutional racism was already making some pretty strong negative points. And here's another thing that they're doing.
Yep.
So there's all that. But, in answer to your question, I think the idea that addiction's a disease, it wasn't motivated by ill intent. It was motivated by, I think, a positive wish to take the blame, the stigma, the responsibility off of the shoulders of addicts, and rather to say, hey, it's not really their fault, they don't mean it. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, one way to do it is by saying, they've got a real problem, let's call it a disease, because we know that people who have diseases aren't responsible for whatever it is. And so that was a way to try to make it easier to not be cornered and persecuted for the activities that went into addiction.
Well, it seems almost like if a kid's got their hand in the cookie jar again, and by their own free will, they put their hand in the cookie jar, and then the very compassionate, overly empathic dad or mom says, "Oh, no, son. It's okay for you to eat all those cookies. It's not your fault. It's my fault, not yours, that you got your hand in the cookie jar." Doesn't that seem to stunt a person's development?
Well, it certainly takes the responsibility away.
It does.
Yes. So in that respect, yeah, it does.
So,
which for a 4-year-old is not a bad thing.
Because like we advocate for kind of, recognition that each of us is the captain of our own ships, right? And it's true we don't control the winds or the waves. So later we're going to talk about how, for example, disability or poverty might impact one's ability to cope with life and perhaps susceptibility to addiction. So we don't control everything. It's not like we can each independently just be an island.
That's for sure.
But at the same time, it's the very opposite's not true either. It's not like we completely lack agency.
Right.
And there almost seems to be this implication in a lot of the discourse around the disease model of addiction that an addict, in a more modern version of the fiend, lacks agency. Do you perceive the same thing, or?
Yeah, that's pretty close, yeah. In fact, when I give talks, I often show a slide that presents a billboard on the side of the highway in Massachusetts, I think it is, showing 5 or 6 people who look moderately content but not very happy. And the slogan is, "It's a disease. It's not a," how does it go? "It's not a choice, it's a disease." So what they're saying, the subtext is clearly that, it's not our fault. And they're looking kind of like, "Oh, it's too bad this happened. This is really a drag, but hey, it happened."
Well, it's also kind of the view underlined by AA, where one of the 12 steps or 12 tenets is that you have to kind of acknowledge or admit that you've lost control over the addiction and that you got to give yourself up to a higher power.
That's right.
And that's never quite sat well with me because, at least in my experience, we're working with my clients to primarily to quit smoking, but also to, to stop overeating food or to not drink so much.
Right.
The experience seems to be the more I have my client take agency, the better the outcomes are.
Yeah.
Whereas if they just kind of give themselves up to the addiction, to the feelings, to the impulses, that seems very counterproductive to the goals that they have.
Yeah.
How the heck is it that AA and the disease model have become such popular models of how addiction works when we're on the same page? And I think a lot of our listeners, in their own experiences, even if they've never used hard drugs, in their own experiences, it seems like they do have choice, and it's detrimental to deny that choice that they each have.
So I argue that a lot, and I talk about how a sense of efficacy, of self-empowerment, can be a very, very powerful tool in overcoming addiction. And to put it simply, it's like, I'm really sick of this. This is a shitty life, life experience. I don't like this. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to make it. I'm going to stop it. And how do I do that? Well, let me see. I could go see a therapist. I could do this or that. I could become involved in other activities. I could make other friends. I could become involved in other social contexts. And one way or another, they find a way. And the statistics show very clearly that most people who are addicted to anything, including heroin, or these days fentanyl, I suppose, do in fact stop. I was going to say recover because that's the coin of the realm, but I don't like the word recover because it's got this very strong medical ring to it. But they do stop, and they stop mostly without the help of any kind of formal treatment. In fact, the conventional rehab setting, rehab and addiction treatment centers, have a very notorious history of not working well, costing a lot of money, and the revolving doors, means that you're going to be back again in 6 months or a year or 2 years. And so, sorry, guy. Wish we could help.
There's almost this cruel irony that the practices, the paradigms, the philosophies that make the most money are the ones that are disseminated most widely and often end up being researched most completely, or at least publicized most completely.
Publicized, yeah.
And the practices that are impossible to monetize, like quitting cold turkey, seem to get no publicity and then no research money.
Right, and it can be cold turkey or it can be gradual. There's an awful lot of ways to overcome addiction. Sometimes, it's complete abstinence. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's controlled use. Sometimes it's gradually decreasing, tapering use. But I think we have to be careful about, the pointing the finger here. AA doesn't make any money. AA is
Fair enough.
Famous because it's free, and it's been around since the 30s, and it's extremely useful and attractive to people who can't afford any kind of formal medically oriented treatment. So that's where they go. And AA does work for some people. I mean, the estimates are anywhere from 5% to 35 or 40%. That's not too terrible, but 5% is not very good. I mean, a lot depends on context, the nature of the group, the makeup of the group, the relationship with the sponsor, the kind of drug, the kind of other societal factors that you alluded to, which might include economic and social and prejudicial, racism, and all kinds of things. But anyway, long story short, AA sometimes works. And AA doesn't fit with the disease model perfectly either. It was kind of a strange marriage. So AA came along, the idea that you can't make it go away. You can't make it stop. That is that you have to admit that from the get-go. However, you can control it, and you need to control it, and you must control it. Like if you're a diabetic, you need to take your insulin. Okay, so there's that, but also the disease model, the implication that this is something that needs to be treated by a medical establishment and can be addressed with certain drugs, with certain pharmaceuticals, for methadone and Suboxone and so on and so forth. Naltrexone is now a big deal. So, that doesn't fit with the philosophy of AA very well at all. And a lot of what treatment centers do and have done for the last 50 or 75 years or so have been to kind of merge the two. The 12-step approach on the one hand, cognitively, behaviorally, and also the idea of being in a group, the idea of fellowship. Really important. Fellowship. It's got nothing to do with a disease model. You're not going to do any better if you're with a group of fellow diabetics, right? As long as you take your insulin.
Yeah.
But AA, the fellowship idea in AA is really fundamental. It's really intrinsic to how it works. So somehow this kind of forced marriage took place, and in rehab centers that sprang up all over the U.S., especially in the 50s and 60s and 70s, merged these two models together and tried to make a kind of coherent integration between the two.
Right. Well, my read of AA is that it works despite each member having to kind of deny responsibility or give up agency. It doesn't work because of that. It works because of the fellowship that you mentioned and the social support. One kind of mental model of addiction I'm kind of playing around with inside my head is that whatever it is that gives people that kind of dopamine hit, which I'm sure is oversimplified, but whatever gives them that nice feeling, it's a poor substitute for the authentic kind of connection and camaraderie, even affection and love that we get socially. This is why the opiate crisis in the U.S. is so oftenly found among lonely rural men. It's because if they had loving families, if they had lots of friends, they'd be less susceptible to addiction.
Yeah.
And AA kind of gives people that sense of community and fellowship and camaraderie that, well, unfortunately, methadone does not.
Right.
And then methadone kind of, hits the neurotransmitters correctly. And the fellowship, just kind of might do that obliquely.
Yeah.
So that's,
right.
I don't know how educated that reading of AA is, but, at least from my perspective, that's kind of how I interpret how it works.
I think that's a big part of it, yeah. I think that's not a bad way of putting it. And the idea of fellowship, camaraderie, and feeling cared for, feeling that sense of belonging, that really is fundamental.
Yeah.
And for any form of addiction, I think it was put very simply by Johann Hari. Johann Hari wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, which is a wonderful book about the war on drugs. And Chasing the Scream pertains to what was his name? The first guy who was the head of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency in the U.S., heard some woman screaming down the hall. She was a morphine addict, and I suppose she was coming off morphine, and she was screaming, and he was chasing the scream. He was going to put a stop to this kind of stuff, right? Anyway, whatever. It's a wonderful book. It's a beautiful narrative. And what Johann Hari says, and this is highlighted in his TED Talk. So if you don't have time for the book, you should go get to the TED Talk. Johann Hari, Johannhari. And what he says is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. So there it is.
I'm completely in agreement.
Yeah. So, yeah, in a way, most addictions, and even addictions, we can sort of understand with opioids and alcohol, they do connect with opioid receptors and help us to feel more relaxed and more comfy and cozy. That's an addiction I understand since I had it myself in my 20s. I struggled with an opiate addiction for years. But even people who are addicted to cigarettes, to tobacco, or psychostimulants, cocaine or methamphetamine, although it's not cozy and comforting per se, it does make you feel that you belong with or to a drug, really. This is my familiar experience. This is my world, which I can go into whenever I want and feel taken care of and feel safe, and that's a big deal. And of course, that is indeed an alternative. It's a substitute for feeling cared for and feeling like you belong with a social or familial
And it's always
group.
a poor substitute because cigarettes can never love you.
No.
Even a dog, a cat can love you.
Yes.
Right? And of course, a friend, a partner, a
I don't know about
child,
cats.
No, I definitely do know about cats. But even like a hamster, right? Even a hamster can like cozy up next to you.
Yes,
and
it's cuddling, yeah.
And a hamster, therefore, is superior to a cigarette.
Yeah. I mean, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so I work with a lot of smokers. At this point, I
Oh, you
wouldn't
do,
be
don't you?
surprised
Yeah.
if it's over 1,000. And so frequently I hear that cigarettes give companionship. Cigarettes give my client a sense that they have a friend, and then quitting smoking almost feels like they're betraying a friend or abandoning a friend.
Or abandoning, yes.
That's where I
Giving up.
really have to make the point that your friends are not trying to kill you.
But cigarettes aren't trying to kill you.
Well, I mean, the
We
effect-
anthropomorphize it and say, in fact, they're really bad for you, and they are going to increase your chances of dying from various diseases, for sure, but they're not trying to kill you.
So it's fair to give all the agency to the human being in the equation.
I know you agree with that.
And yeah. So you're right. I am anthropomorphizing cigarettes, but when my client anthropomorphizes cigarettes by describing them as a friend, I mean, we must further that analogy by painting, the feelings that they get from tobacco as a traitorous kind of friendship and not actually the real thing.
Yeah, you and I have talked about this before a few times, and I think we agree in a lot of ways. I think there's an awful lot of overlap between our perspectives, but it's not total overlap, because I think you feel much more absolute about that than I do. And I think, for example, of a good friend of mine named Sean Shelley. He struggled with his own addiction in Cape Town, South Africa, and he's fine with me saying that. He talks about it all the time. After he gave up on crystal meth, he got his Ph.D., became involved in all kinds of agencies and bodies that were trying to help people who had addiction problems throughout Africa. He actually served on the United Nations Committee for Drug Reform. He's done a lot of wonderful work and came a long way, so to speak. However, he talks about what, for example, smoking heroin does for young black men in Cape Town. And it's not evil, and it's not, what's the word, malicious or malevolent. It's a social habit that does involve a chemical influx, but it's also something they do together that makes them feel we talk about alcohol as being a social lubricant. Yeah. Like, there's something to that, right?
Yeah.
And opioids are also a social lubricant. In fact, opioids, when you give opioids to rats and mice, they have more fun together. They play more. They really do.
Yeah.
So, opioids soften edges.
Yes. Okay, so let me explain the absolutism. It's actually more in language than it is in thought.
Okay.
Because I'm not a prohibitionist.
Yeah.
I actually have no disdain for, and I don't think that drugs are all bad. In fact, I think that the resurgence of psychedelics recently as a possible treatment for PTSD, for example, is a very good thing. And ketamine, for example, could be used recreationally or it could be used therapeutically.
Right.
And of course, cocaine and heroin originally had therapeutic uses. So like I'm not one to like demonize drugs.
Right.
The reason for the absolutist speech is because for better or for worse, the less room you leave for doubt when you're communicating, the stronger the point you make. So I guess for this kind of academic conversation, I'll just add in the asterisk that I'm not like against the responsible and informed use of drugs in a way that's legal for your jurisdiction.
Okay.
But yeah, when I'm trying to get someone to quit smoking, then I do have to speak in an absolutist way.
I believe that.
Or when I'm trying to get someone to stop using alcohol or heroin to kind of resolve the inner debate or ambiguity in the client's mind. As a hypnotherapist, I kind of had to give one clear, unambiguous, neatly packaged idea, as simplistic as the idea would be if we kind of try to unpack it in more of a scholarly kind of context.
I can see that. I mean, as a clinical psychologist, I often, will use words and ideas also in a way that's intended to help people think and feel a little bit differently about whatever it is they're engaged in that seems to be harming them or blocking them. And no, you're right. It's not an academic, point that you're making. You're not trying to make a foolproof, argument-proof point. So it's a different,
Well, I'm kind of keeping in mind that some of our listeners are kind of they're kind of tuning in because they can't afford hypnotherapy or psychotherapy, or they can't like afford rehab for sure. To kind of see, let's say, tobacco as a traitor and not a friend is going to help in one's journey to quit smoking.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So I'm not actually as black and white of a thinker as sometimes I communicate.
That's good. Yeah.
Like I am.
Yeah. And certainly I'm not anti-drug. I mean, there's like uses for almost every drug. And I don't even draw a line between what you might call recreational and therapeutic use, because there is no clear line, and especially with psychedelics. I mean, psychedelics, if you want to think of it as treatment, think of it as a treatment for life in our current, cosmopolitan age, because psychedelics help you connect with nature and think about your role in the universe. And do you want to call that treatment, or it's not treatment or recreational, it's something else. Something's hard to define.
Yeah. Well, in previous episodes, we've kind of spoken against the mind-body dichotomy, where it's kind of this artificial divide to say we can like just treat the mind or we treat the body independently of the mind. Well, no. Like anything that you put in the body, it's going to affect your mind. And if you think in certain ways, it's going to affect the body too.
Yes.
So we're each one individual organism, and it's kind of a fictitious concept to divide mind and body.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
it's way too neat, and it doesn't really make much sense if you think about it a little bit more.
Yeah. So you've been kind of trying to challenge the medical model of addiction, and with some success, considering how many books you've sold. I'm sure that along the way you've gotten some pushback. I'm sure along the way you've kind of rubbed people with a profit motive in the wrong way. So how's this journey been like? How successful have you been in kind of like helping others to overcome the stigma of drug use, or the idea that it is a disease as opposed to a learned habit?
There's been certainly pushback. Generally speaking, I think my argument, my view, my perspective has been taken well, and a lot of people are saying, "Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, got it." I'm not the only one who takes this position. There's quite a number of other people, who are sort of addiction scholars or addiction might be doing research in addiction or might be doing clinical practice related to addiction, who also feel that the medical model has gone in the wrong direction. And so the pushback that we have gotten, some of that comes from all different sources. For example, I mean, whenever you kind of perturb a societal habit, you're going to get some kind of crap from somewhere, maybe from many places. So one source of that for me was in the US, especially where I give talks sometimes, is like people say, if we don't call it a disease, then we can't get medical insurance to cover the cost of treatment. Yeah, sorry about that. That's actually a political and economic issue. It is not a psychological issue. It's certainly not a scientific issue or a biological issue. You want to talk about your healthcare system? Yeah, it's pretty fucked up. The American healthcare system obviously epitomizes certain real problems where profit and healthcare meet head to head, not in a very satisfactory way. So, yeah, sorry about that. You need a name for this, so then you can throw money at it or get the insurance companies to throw money at it. Same thing for a lot of other things, by the way. Racism. Now we have anti-racism. So now we can support research dollars for anti-racism or clinical or institutional practices for anti-racism because we've given it a title. Terrific. Bullying, again, anti-bullying programs. Domestic abuse, right? Child abuse, all kinds of abuse has now gotten very much highlighted and entitled, and now but I don't mean entitled. I mean given a title, given a category heading, label, makes it easier to pinpoint it and to say, okay, this is how we need to deal with it, whether it comes from a source of contributions, whether it's monetary, whether it's governmental, institutional, legal, whatever it is. It helps you, focus on the problem and try to do something about it. So in that respect, I see the argument.
Right.
If I take away the label, what are we going to call it? How are we going to deal with it? Well, like you and I have been talking about, it's a much broader issue than just a person's relationship to particular substances or activities. Whether it's booze, whether it's drugs, whether it's gambling, whether it's porn, whether it's phone use, whether it's internet use. There are so many kinds of addictive activities, and it's completely intermingled with the rest of our psychological and social lives. It isn't a distinct phenomenon or a distinct category. So don't even try. There's better ways to understand it.
Yep. Well, one pattern I've noticed among people, so, you mentioned porn, there's alcohol, there's all sorts of drugs. One pattern I've noticed, two patterns actually. One of them is that it seems like we've all accepted the idea that we can't just be, and we've always got to do or consume something, or else we're not good enough.
Yeah, that's part of it.
And that's tied in with this idea that we shan't love ourselves because it's arrogant, or because it's going to, divide up a finite amount of love as though we don't generate more of it ourselves. But it's almost like this, at least these two views seem to exist in every client I have who smokes cigarettes or drinks alcohol. It's where they can't just sit alone with their own thoughts like a monk on a mountaintop, feeling their hearts and feeling loving kindness.
Yeah.
And you might say I'm overly simplifying things, and I would admit in some ways I am. To say that if only we all learned how to quietly sit with our own thoughts.
Yeah, but being a monk on a mountaintop is not going to be the way for most people.
But here's the cool thing. We don't actually have to seclude ourselves from civilization. When we each have private homes or at least bedrooms, we can all retreat into, or even in a city, we can put on our, noise-canceling headphones. We could close our eyes. We could pretend we're on a mountaintop. So I'm just kind of painting an image with a monk on a mountaintop. But the idea is wherever we find seclusion, wherever we find privacy and quiet is our mountaintop. And, so it's no excuse that there's no mountain in sight in downtown Toronto. Wherever, even in we're in the downtown core right now. We're actually not far from one of the busiest intersections in the city. It's actually also very quiet in here because we boarded up the windows.
Right.
So this is like an example of a mountaintop in here.
Yeah.
Now, let's say here, I'm breathing deeply enough. I'm looking to where the glass is half full in life. I'm thinking of those I care about. I'm generating within myself nice, warm, and fuzzy feelings, right? Now I'm kind of losing my desire to go play a video game. I'm losing my desire to catch up on the latest episode of this show I might be watching on Amazon Video, right? I try to introspect to understand humanity. It's under the idea we have more in common than we have differences, and I, can examine myself way better than anyone else. So, if I ascertain that a practice seems to help me, then plausibly it could help another. So I'm kind of imagining that if I only were to teach people how to find their version of a mountaintop, to be with where the glass is half full for them, to breathe deeply enough, to think of those they do care about, then they're going to start losing their desire to have to consume, to have to do, to have to fill in the void, because the void's being filled in with the good things I'm having them think about. Do you think that love is an adequate solution? That's the question.
I think there's an awful lot of stuff that compiled together in your perspective there. And I think in many ways I do agree. Well, the two main things are, I would say, sort of mindfulness, capacity to reflect and to have some silence so you can reflect on your own thoughts and not take everything as a given and not just rush along with the capitalist enterprise and be a cog in the machine or a brick in the wall, as Pink Floyd put it, right? So yes, that kind of mindfulness is super important. That's a little bit different than the sort of practice of love and kindness and goodness, which, that's another way of fulfilling our potential as people. Both of them can help us not require other kinds of input and other kinds of busyness. The busyness thing, back when I was being supervised as a grad student in psychotherapy techniques, I studied psychoanalysis and stuff. They called it the manic defense. There's something called the manic defense. It's a really simple idea that of all the defense mechanisms, being manic is kind of like the default. It's the basic one. Because by going after goals and doing, achieving whatever it is that you're going after and moving towards or away from very particular things in the world, you are feeling feelings of connection, involvement, and utility that are really good to feel. So what about that? Well, we don't necessarily want to get rid of that because, every baby needs to feel that in order to pull away from mom and dad and to go reaching across the room and learn to crawl and grab at things and pull them off the shelf and suck on them or play with them. And all of cognitive development requires that kind of, manic is a strong word, but it requires going after goals. So how is addiction different? It's somehow it is like a white noise machine. It's kind of, it blots out other forms of connection. That's what I would say, right? So, so the kind of connection you get by pursuing normal goals, so to speak, like good goals that are interesting and novel enough to be, worth thinking about, gets replaced by going after the same thing day after day or hour after hour or month after month or year after year. That's a whole different kind of enterprise. That's not just being too involved in activity and not having enough time to reflect. There's a kind of intrinsic boringness to that. Repetition numbs you, right? It turns off a lot of aspects of having a well-functioning mind, brain, and heart. But as for the role of love, you and I agree about that. Feeling love for other people, feeling that connection, concern, care, respect, and for oneself, fundamental practices, a strange word, fundamental way of connecting with other people that is tremendously fulfilling, that indeed feels really good. And by the way, yes, it does actually stimulate opioid receptors. In fact, mother's milk has opioids in it.
So when I use the word love, I'm not talking about like romantic love, which is highs and downs, right? It's a little artificial and it's seldomly lasting. So I took a Vipassana meditation course one of the 10-day Goenka retreats
Okay.
many, many years ago. In fact, 2 weeks before I opened the Morpheus Clinic for Hypnosis, and I got back and I rent out this office, which is now our studio,
Yeah.
and I opened it up 2 weeks after I got back from that retreat.
Right.
But the term is loving kindness,
Yes.
which is an English translation of the word metta,
Yes.
METTA. So when I talk about like sitting quietly with your own thoughts and feeling your own heart and causing your own good feelings that way, I'm not really talking about like pursuing romantic love or even like parental love or love for a child or even love for like a cat or a dog.
Right.
I'm talking about this loving kindness that's for all human beings.
Right.
And that one can feel when he or she is on their own.
Yeah, and I would say also that kind of love, and yes, metta, that Buddhist term covers it, there is something that is intrinsically connects that with mindfulness. Because to love in that way, whether it's someone else or yourself, you need to get them. You need to actually think about what it's like to be that person. What's it like for you? I don't know what it's like for you. You have a very different life than I do, of course. And what's it like for people of other genders or races or economic conditions, and all that stuff requires a certain amount of reflection and thoughtfulness, which to me is pretty close to mindfulness. It's like, what's it like? And also when we are loving ourselves, caring for ourselves, I use a kind of psychotherapy now in my psychology practice called internal family systems, which is getting quite popular these days. IFS is the acronym, IFS, Internal Family Systems. First thing I always tell people, it's not family therapy. No, that's a misnomer. The internal family is this, the family of parts or voices, they call them parts of ourselves. The part that is craving fulfillment, like the addictive part, give me more. The part that is critical, you're being an idiot, I can't believe you're doing that again, what a jerk. The part that whatever, there's a number of different parts of us. The just pure needy, I feel alone, I need to be cared for. The part that, all that. Okay, so what about that? It's kind of analogous to the way we need to understand other people is to really consider them. What's it like to be you? And then in IFS, it's astounding the way it works. In IFS, you kind of look at your parts very deliberately and say, what's it like for you, internal critic, to be this critical, mean, accusatory part of me? What's that like for you? Well, I do that because you get in so much trouble all the time. You're always, screwing up and, banging your head against the wall, and I just can't have that anymore. I need to get you under control. Oh, that's different. How do you know? How do you get that? Well, you really have to look inside. So it is a kind of mindfulness involved in understanding what's going on inside or in other people.
Well, it kind of raises the idea that the questions you ask yourself are going to evoke certain answers or even certain domains of answer.
Yeah.
So asking the question of one's inner critic, what's it like for you, evokes far higher quality answers than asking the inner critic, could you please shut up?
Yes,
right?
Exactly, yes.
So
that's the main point, yeah.
Yeah, well, often the questions we ask ourselves are just simply not very good questions.
You're right.
So a common question is, what's wrong with me? Well, anytime you ask the question, what's wrong with me?
You're setting it up.
You're setting it, like it's a leading question. You're going to come up with everything bad about you.
Yes, it's a leading question.
Exactly.
And with the addict self, the famous addict self, which, in AA is doing push-ups in the parking lot. They actually have this expression. Your addict self, your addiction is doing push-ups, strengthening itself while you're in here trying to be a good boy or girl. Sorry, but, that doesn't quite wash. So, what is this addictive part actually trying to do? The craving part. I want more. I want to drink. I want to drink tonight. I don't want to be sober. I don't want to abstain. What's that like for you? Well, I know that this helps you. It soothes you. It makes you feel better. I want us to feel better, so to speak. I mean, it's kind of strange to put that in language, but I want us to feel better. So that's what I do for us.
In any kind of good communication, you want to assume good faith.
Yes.
So in your inner dialogue, you want to assume good faith.
That's pretty much the idea. And in fact, Richard Schwartz, the founder, his latest book is called No Bad Parts. Precisely that.
Yes.
They're all kind of on your side, one way or another.
Yep. And even the part that wants you to use heroin or go on a bender has some kind of positive intention.
Yeah.
And when you're asking the right questions, you arrive at that positive intention, and then you can meet that positive intention in some more holistically appropriate or beneficial way.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much so. And so when you really get into conversation with these parts of oneself, the addict self being the most prevalent, is like, okay, I want to, instead of like trying to get rid of you and toss you in the trash and, you know, talk you until you're whatever, until you give up on me, I'm going to accept what you need, what you want, and we're going to work together. Which sounds really odd. Who's doing the talking if that's a part of yourself? Well, somehow it works.
Yeah.
And so you're bringing a perspective and a mindfulness together with that urge and saying, we're going to actually kind of just gently we're going to modify the way we get this feeling, the way it works, so that it doesn't kill us, so that it doesn't hurt us, it doesn't get us in horrible trouble at home, with the family, with your partner, with your bank account, etc.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And it works. And everybody, all the different parts actually say, yeah, please, that would be nice.
Well, the thing with addiction is, because so often addiction follows from trauma.
Yeah.
And so often there's this undercurrent of shame that's underlying any form of addiction. Often when one superficially examines their inner dialogue, there's nothing good going on inside.
That's right.
It's all, why you're bad, or why you're shameful, or how you're a mess up. So that's why asking oneself, what's wrong with me, which the medical model almost kind of does.
Kind of.
I guess it,
Well, I would say different.
Yeah.
I think we're going to tell you what's wrong with you. We're going to look it up. We've got all kinds of data on this. We're going to let you know what's wrong with you.
Right. But it's the paradigm of what's wrong as opposed to what's the intent.
Well, yeah, because they're not assuming any kind of teleological, any kind of goal-oriented, conscious, deliberate activity on the part of a virus. Right?
Yeah.
Virus doesn't have much, right?
Fit human beings are way more complex than viruses.
Yeah. So, but anyway, there are parallels with the medical form of diagnosis and analysis.
Thank you for listening to How to Be an Adult. This episode, an interview with Marc Lewis, will be continued in part 2, which will be released in 2 weeks. How to Be an Adult is a production of the Morpheus Clinic for Hypnosis at www.morpheusclinic.com.